My family had always treated me like a doormat, relentlessly bullying and belittling me. The final straw came when I overheard them mocking me behind my back for being single. What they didn't know was that my father had left the entire family estate to me in his will. Now, they were the ones begging for a share of the inheritance. There was a moment of silence, then a chuckle from my mother, a soft, dismissive laugh she always used when she agreed but didn't want to say it out loud. I stood there, hand on the doorknob, completely still. You'd think after all these years I'd be numb to it, that I'd grown thick skin or built some kind of emotional armor. But no, that kind of cruelty doesn't bounce off, it sinks in like cold water seeping through a crack in your bones, settling there heavy and paralyzing. I didn't go inside. I let my hand fall away from the knob, slow and deliberate, as if I were unplugging from something I'd been force-fed my whole life. I stepped back just 1 foot, but it felt like stepping into another world. I stood there on that porch, listening as they carried on inside, oblivious to the fact that I was right there, hearing every damn word. They didn't even have the decency to wait until I walked through the door. That told me everything I needed to know. I was never one of them. I was tolerated, not loved, pitied, not respected. I could have walked in and caused a scene, maybe thrown a wineglass, screamed until I lost my voice, cried in front of them like I used to when I was younger and still foolish enough to think it mattered. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled out my phone with steady hands, scrolled through my contacts, and called Richard. When he picked up, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's time," I said, just 2 words, but he knew exactly what I meant. We had talked about this moment before, years ago, over coffee and unspoken wounds. I told him if it ever came to this, if I ever reached the point where I couldn't pretend anymore, he'd know what to do. I didn't even feel the cold wind rushing against my face or the fading light of the early evening. All I felt was clarity, clear and sharp like glass. I walked back to my car, heels clicking on the driveway like a slow metronome, the rhythm of something ending and something else beginning. It's funny how you can spend a lifetime trying to earn the approval of people who never really saw you. You bend yourself into shapes, shrink your voice, push down everything you are just to be acceptable in their eyes. And then, one ordinary Sunday, you realize that you've never really belonged, that maybe you were never supposed to. I sat in the driver's seat, engine off, just staring at the house. That house used to feel like a prison dressed as a home, the place where I learned to smile on cue and bite my tongue until it bled. Suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't anything they could use against me. I was just done. My sister, Carla, was always the golden one, pretty, married, with 2 kids she paraded like trophies, and a mouth that never shut up about other people's shortcomings. And my mother, Diane, God, that woman could kill you with a look. She was all about appearances, a proper family, a proper daughter, a proper life. Except she only ever considered one of her daughters real enough to count. I wasn't mad at them for what they said, I was mad at myself for taking so long to see the truth. But now, finally, I did. That house wasn't my home anymore, those people weren't my family in any way that mattered. I didn't need their love. I didn't need their pity. What I needed was justice, a calm, clean, legal justice. I'd waited long enough, and the beauty of it all was that they wouldn't even see it coming. Because when you're the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one they laugh at behind closed doors, they never suspect you're the one with the power to burn it all down. And that's exactly what I plan to do. It's strange how certain phrases from childhood stay stuck in your bones, buried deep in places you don't even know exist until someone says something that drags them up again, like rusted chains from the bottom of a dark well. My mother's words, as sharp as chipped porcelain, still echo in my head like they were said yesterday: a woman without a family is just a shadow. She used to say it with this casual finality, like she was reading a universal truth etched in stone, not a cruel judgment passed on her own daughters. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on or someone to tell me I was better than they said I was. I already knew that. What I needed was information. I needed access to my father's old trust documents, the ones no one talked about since he passed away, the ones Richard had quietly hinted at years ago, back when grief was fresh and I still believed, foolishly, that family would hold together on its own without strings or signatures. We sat at that small cafe on Lincoln Avenue, the kind with chipped mugs and mismatched chairs, and I told him flat out, I want everything, Richard. Every page, every clause, every forgotten detail they thought I wouldn't notice. He looked at me for a moment, the way a person stares at a forest right before a storm breaks over it. Then he nodded slowly and asked, "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I didn't blink. I'm more than ready. I've been ready for years. I just didn't know it until now. What Carla and my mother didn't realize in all their smug laughter and shallow cruelty was that my father might have loved them, but he trusted me. He saw something in me they never did. He knew that when the time came, I'd be the one to carry the weight, to see things through with precision, not panic. If there was anything he left behind for me, any final thread of dignity, justice, or legacy, it was time I claimed it before they buried it under their greed and gossip. As Richard reached into his briefcase and handed me a thick folder, the weight of it settled in my lap like something sacred and dangerous all at once. I could already tell that whatever was inside this file wasn't just paper and ink. It was the beginning of something bigger, the kind of truth that doesn't just change things, it burns the whole damn house down. For the first time in years, I felt something that almost resembled peace, but I wasn't naive. I knew this was just the start. I hadn't even opened the folder yet, and already I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. The real question now wasn't whether I'd find something in those documents, the real question was what exactly my father had been hiding from them all this time. The folder Richard handed me felt heavier than it should have, not just by weight, but by the kind of unseen gravity that wraps itself around unfinished business, the kind that has teeth and claws and a pulse of its own. I didn't open it right away. I sat in the car with it resting on my lap for several minutes, staring through the windshield as if the answers might somehow appear on the glass instead of inside those pages. Part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to see in black and white the things I had long suspected but never dared to say aloud. But another part of me, the part that had walked away from that porch with her head high and her heart hardened, needed to see the truth written down. I needed confirmation that I wasn't just imagining things all these years. When I finally peeled back the first page, my breath caught in my throat. The handwriting was unmistakable, my father's, his familiar, slightly slanted script filled the margins. In places, notes crawled in ink that had faded just slightly with time. Richard had bookmarked the relevant documents, and I turned to them with shaking fingers, scanning the lines that would flip my world upside down in the quietest, most devastating way. There it was, clear and undeniable, a revised will, dated 2 years before his death, witnessed, notarized, and sealed under lock. A revised will that no one in my family knew existed except Richard and, until now, me. A revised will that changed everything we had been led to believe about how his estate would be handled. My father, ever the practical and cautious man, had seen through the performance my mother and sister perfected over the years. He had seen how quick they were to manipulate, to embellish, to twist affection into obligation and kindness into leverage. So he left them just enough to save face but not a dime more. The controlling interest in the estate, the business holdings, the property rights, even the trust fund my mother always lorded over as if it were her divine right, it was all mine. All of it. But there was a catch, of course. My father didn't just hand me the keys to the kingdom and call it a day. He left a stipulation: I must activate the revised will before I turn 45. If I failed to do so, if I waited too long or chose to keep playing the background role I'd mastered all my life, then everything would revert to my mother by default, and the old original will, untouched and outdated, would stand as the final word. I sat there in stunned silence, rereading the clause over and over again as if it might change on the 4th or 5th for a pianist to play low ambient music and chose a menu that sounded expensive enough to make Carla feel off balance, but not so ridiculous that it became obvious I was flexing. Every detail was curated, every moment rehearsed in my head. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a performance, and I was no longer content to sit in the audience while they read their lines. When they arrived, both of them walked in with that cautious curiosity that people get when they sense something's wrong but can't quite name it yet. Carla wore her usual designer armor, sharp angles and soft smugness, while Diane came wrapped in her typical air of judgment, pursed lips and tired pearls, already scanning the room for something to critique. I greeted them with a warmth I didn't feel and a smile that didn't reach my eyes, offered them wine, and gestured toward the table like a hostess who had always belonged in a room like this. I wore a dress they'd never seen before, black, sleek, tailored to every inch of my body like a second skin. I knew Carla would notice. I wanted her to. I wanted her to sit across from me and realize that the version of me she'd built in her head, the failure, the ghost, the punchline, didn't exist anymore. I could feel her eyes scanning me, trying to find a crack in the surface, some sign that this was all a temporary illusion, but there was nothing for her to find. I was calm, I was ready, and I was finally holding the cards. Dinner began with forced pleasantries and hollow conversation, as expected. Carla talked about her kids, Diane made snide little comments about the house being a bit cold for a dinner, and I let them speak, let them fill the silence with their usual self-centered noise. I waited until dessert was served, until the wine had settled in, and they were just comfortable enough to let their guard down. Then I lifted my glass slowly, letting the light catch the crystal, and said it as simply as possible, I've decided to take over Dad's estate, effective next week. For a second, no one said anything. It was that perfect kind of silence, thick, stunned, full of static. Then Carla set her fork down with a sharp clink and leaned forward, eyes blazing as if she couldn't quite believe the audacity. "What the hell are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice already rising. Diane's expression changed instantly, shifting from confusion to horror to something colder, something manipulative and brittle, the way only mothers like her can do when they feel control slipping from their hands. "Laura," she said softly, feigning concern, "you don't know what you're doing. You're letting bitterness cloud your judgment. You're tearing this family apart." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or try to defend myself with long explanations. I simply looked at both of them and said, clear and steady, "I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm just picking up what you all thought I was too stupid to notice." Carla stood up then, practically shaking with rage, hurling accusation after accusation across the table like a child denied a toy. "You're pathetic," she hissed. "You think you can just waltz in and take everything? You think Dad would have wanted this?" But that was the thing, he did want this. The only reason she hadn't seen it coming was that she never believed I was capable of anything other than sitting quietly and watching her take what she wanted. Diane tried a different tactic, her voice softer now, full of that manipulative maternal pity she perfected over decades. "Sweetheart," she said, "this isn't you. You don't really want this fight." I smiled at her, not kindly. "You don't know what I want. You never did." As the tension settled thick and bitter around us, I stood up and walked toward the window, letting them sit in the discomfort they'd never once allowed themselves to feel. They had always assumed I needed their approval to be someone, they never realized I was already someone before they started trying to erase me. Just as I thought I'd finally said everything that needed to be said, I felt a presence behind me, quiet and hesitant. Carla's husband, Greg, stood awkwardly near the edge of the room, hands in his pockets, eyes darting between me and the floor. He waited until Diane and Carla were occupied in their own separate stages of meltdown before leaning in slightly. "Laura," he said, "can we talk for a minute alone?" I turned toward him, surprised, unsure of what angle he was playing, but there was something about his face, nervous, unsettled, maybe even guilty, that made me pause. He wasn't just making small talk, he had something to say, and somehow I already knew it wasn't going to be small. I stared at him for a moment longer, absorbing the weight of what he was offering, wondering why now, after all this time, he was suddenly eager to set fire to his wife's carefully crafted life. As if reading my mind, he said, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I'm tired. She treats me like, Laura, like a damn accessory she can throw in a closet when she doesn't need to impress anyone. I've put up with her affairs, her lies, her little superiority complex for years, and I've got nothing to show for it but also a mortgage I didn't ask for. You want to take her down? Fine. I won't stop you." I nodded slowly, still processing the magnitude of it all. Greg didn't stick around long. He handed me a flash drive with a quiet, "Do what you want with it," then turned and walked out like a man who had finally dropped the load he'd been carrying on his back for far too long. Just like that, I held 2 ticking bombs in my hands, legal control of the estate and now moral leverage strong enough to blow Carla's image to dust. But I didn't detonate them right away. I let them simmer, let them stew just beneath the surface while the rest of the family began reacting to the news of my takeover. As expected, Diane moved quickly, weaponizing her voice, her history, and her carefully curated image as the matriarch everyone was supposed to respect. She started calling relatives, spinning her narrative like a spider weaving silk, painting me as some ungrateful, heartless thief who swooped in during her moment of grief to dismantle her late husband's legacy. "She's turning everything upside down," she said to anyone who would listen. She's rewriting our family story just to make herself feel important. What she didn't know, and would never see coming, was that I had no intention of simply taking the estate and letting it rot under the same old structures. No, I wanted something better, something lasting, something that didn't just settle scores but also made sure the cycle ended with me. I told Richard to start the restructuring immediately, cut Carla and Diane out of all financial authority, freeze access to every account under my father's name, and redirect the majority of the assets into a private foundation named after my father, a foundation that would fund education grants, support small business startups, and provide aid to domestic violence shelters. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was the importance of building something beyond revenge. And still, I said nothing to Carla or Diane directly. I let them swim in their own panic, let them whisper and speculate and try to claw back whatever little scraps of power they thought they still had. I kept my voice steady and my movements quiet because sometimes the most devastating blows come from silence, not screams. But then something happened I didn't expect. Late one night, while going through another stack of old documents from Richard's files, I found something that didn't belong, a name I didn't recognize scrawled on the corner of a photocopied letter tucked between legal amendments. It wasn't a relative's name or a business partner or someone from a trust designation. It was personal, intimate, handwritten in a way that felt deliberate, almost secretive. The name was Lena Whitaker, and something about it made my skin prickle. There were no notes attached, no explanation, no records under that name in any official documentation, just that name written in my father's unmistakable hand beside a line that read, "If she comes forward, give her what she's owed." I stared at those words for what felt like hours, my mind racing through every conversation I'd ever had with my father, every memory that now suddenly seemed incomplete. Who was she? What did he mean by what she's owed? And why had she never come forward? Unless, of course, she didn't even know she was supposed to. Just when I thought I had control of the narrative, just when I believed I was the one unearthing every reburied truth, another thread appeared, one I hadn't even known existed, one that could unravel everything all over again. Because now there was someone else in the story, and I had no idea what her part would be. For days, the name Lena Whitaker haunted me like a whisper I couldn't quite chase down, a thread dangling in the corner of everything I thought I'd already unraveled, refusing to be ignored. I kept going back to that single sentence written in my father's handwriting, "If she comes forward, give her what she's owed." And every time I read it, I felt a strange weight settling deeper into my chest. This wasn't a business matter, it wasn't some forgotten investor or a clerical oversight buried in a file. This was personal, and no matter how hard I tried to tell myself it didn't matter.